let's go to the regulatory environment element and dig a little deeper, and let's try to differentiate between rhetoric and policy. Not to say that an executive order is not impactful. They are, but as Claudia mentioned, some of the language is a little softer. It almost looks like what Dennis Whalen would write, as opposed to Claudia Allen, who's a disciplined attorney. But it is what it is, and we live in the world that we live in. So let's talk about the post-election regulatory environment, or the deregulatory implications, and kind of try to have a conversation around the anticipated shifts that you all expect to see in 2025. So, Travis, why don't you start us off and frame where you think we are and what the expectations might be for 2025?
Sure. So we've got a lot of different constituencies on this call, people in different industries, people in different parts of the country, people that have international businesses versus not. Each of them are going to be affected differently. I think, one of the main focuses of Trump's first 100 days has been DEI and how that rolls through both the federal government, federal contractors, and honestly, other companies that have DEI policies or receive money directly or indirectly from the federal government. That's something that honestly has been a trend since last year. The Harvard case, I think most well-advised companies have been trying to find what their core values are and what the drivers of their business are, both from their stakeholders, but also economically, and have been making pivots or sticking to their guns in response to that for over a year now. I think that there's going to be more scrutiny on that, particularly at the federal and at the state level. But it's not new. It's just a heightened scrutiny. I think, I mentioned antitrust regulation. There's an expectation from some groups that, well, with Lena Khan gone, the federal government is open for business for every single industry to do all deals that it wants. I think if you look back to the first Trump administration, they had higher scrutiny over certain sectors, particularly social media businesses and big tech software. That's probably why we had so many of the tech luminaries standing behind Trump during his inauguration. If you have import-export, those controls are going to become stronger, particularly if you have transactions that are going to be reviewed by CFIUS, Team Telecom, or other kind of national security-focused items. And then the last I'd throw out there is grant money. If you are receiving money from the federal government, whether that is Medicare, Medicaid, whether that is NIH grants, whether that is energy, DOE, or federal defense, you should expect that the money coming, the review, and really this is for everything, the review and efficiency of government is going to be slowed down. The pace of government action will be reduced across the board. And so it's not necessarily deregulation, no regulation. It's, hey, I need to get an answer from the government, but nobody's picking up the phone.
Great, thanks for that. On our prep call, you talked about something that predated Trump, so maybe share a little bit about that. We're starting to see a shift with some companies relocating from Delaware, which was the bellwether jurisdiction, to other states like Texas, like Nevada. Share some of the factors about how that's evolving, and how boards should think about those changes. Not all change is good, but you can't not be aware of things and make some conscious decisions as things around you shift.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I am biased. I sit in Texas. I've been practicing Delaware and Texas law my entire career. There is a real Dexit question, like, should we get out of Delaware? Do I get more certainty if I go to another state? The way I frame it typically is you've got Delaware that has become very plaintiff friendly. It's not the Delaware of the 90s because of Caremark claims, derivatives proceedings, and the like. You have Nevada that is, it's very difficult to bring a claim against directors or anyone in Nevada. And Texas is trying to take that Goldilocks zone of business certainty, but still being investable. There is actually a regulatory battle going on right now where Texas will be adopting statute after statute. And Delaware actually proposed, I think Monday, a new set of statutes to try and codify some business judgment and controlling shareholder issues. But right now, I mean, we have 7 different large public companies that are exploring moving to Texas. We have like actively exploring, not just, hey, let's have a conversation. And several others that are probably going to follow suit. If you are thinking, hey, I may want to get a serious material transaction done in the next few years, but I'm not going to do it this year, it may make sense to move to Texas first and then go through the process of exploring that afterwards so that you don't have to worry as much about the plaintiff bar second guessing you. Or if you live in a risky climate and derivative proceedings or Caremark proceedings because you have a plant explode or some other negative outcome isn't something that you want, there's a real economic benefit. And it's an economic question, not a legal question at this point between them. But Delaware is going to try and fight back. They are passing laws. They are going to find a way, if they can get it through the lobbyists and the plaintiffs bar, to mitigate some of the risk that a couple of their judges have created.
Hey, Claudia, I know you love surprises, so let me give you a quick surprise. You're one of the 2 practicing attorneys. Well, one of the two attorneys on the call, deep in background, similar to Travis.
Yeah.
And most importantly, you're not based in Texas. What say you?
I think Delaware had been a very easy play. There's been a lot of consternation in the last year or so, particularly as to controlled companies and the transactions getting hung up. And, that created an opportunity for a state like Texas, which is trying to, go down the middle. I think, the governor of Delaware is quite aware of this issue. And so that legislation that was introduced in both houses of the Delaware legislature on Monday simultaneously, without going through the usual process of going through the Delaware bar, probably indicates that has a good chance of going through. And what it really attempts to do is just restore for transaction planners some very clear rules of the road to eliminate some of this second guessing. So I think Delaware is going to fiercely protect its franchise. And I think, in terms of the relative benefits, I think Travis was alluding to, there's going to be a new court in Texas that's just devoted to business cases. But in terms of Delaware, some of the signal features are it has a really experienced judiciary, has a well-developed body of case law, and perhaps most importantly in the deal context, it can move lightning fast compared to most other courts. So those are important issues to consider.
Great. Hey, Travis, one question that came in from the audience. Over the last 5-10 years, Texas perhaps hasn't been perceived to be one of the most friendly shareholder states. How does this shifting court to a state that's not deemed to be friendly? I think I moved here and a client had a very major issue and went from no liability to billions of dollars based upon one verdict on one case in one small court in Texas. Why should people jump to this place with that track record?
Yeah, so There's a difference between fiduciary duty cases and contract cases. Just to be clear, getting sued under a contract is one thing. People think about Pennzoil Texaco and that case law. There's another for being sued for fiduciary duty and the like, which is in Texas. You're looking at having a statutory business judgment rule. You're looking at not having a Caremark claim. You're not having to worry about some of the procedural items that you have in Delaware. Delaware is a demand futility state. Texas is not. We start getting into odd procedural items, but at the end of the day, if somebody's wondering about, I think the question goes to cost of capital and large risk litigation. The contract claims hasn't changed. You've got that same exposure no matter where you are. What we're talking about is the jurisdiction of incorporation, and moving to Texas gives you more statutory certainty than you have in Delaware. Does every single transaction have absolute certainty? No, that's Nevada, and that is where you're actually going to have, potentially a discount on your trading, because somebody could sell the company out from under you and not achieve kind of an optimal price, even in a conflict transaction. Texas, you still have to have reasonable safeguards and the like.
Got it. Thanks. Claudia, let me come back to you and ask you the original question that I had for you. Can you share how you guys are advising and coaching boards to deal with this volume of regulatory change and the uncertainty? Are we open for business? Are we closed? Are the phones going to answer when you ring? And how do you move forward on business? Because business doesn't really wait for administrative changes or administration changes.
I think if you're asking about, the complexity of the environment, I think it's just a fact. We do have heightened complexity. And I think there are no easy answers about, how boards oversee regulation and compliance. I mean, I think, there are clearly a couple of major factors at play. First, the administration is taking, some new positions. And so it's important that the board be educated about what is changing in the law, and that management analyze the impact. So, one rather interesting one is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's suddenly a pause on enforcement, and this seems to be directed toward the bribery portion of the statute. But I don't think anybody should take that as a green light to relax their compliance policies. Other countries may have bribery laws. The act itself has not been amended by Congress. If you think about the practical impact of, relaxing anti-bribery laws, that could actually encourage foreign officials to seek bribes. And companies still have to contend with their own codes of conduct. There are other federal laws that are implied, and there's a 5-year statute of limitations on Foreign Corrupt Practices Act claims. So these things could come back to haunt in the future. So I would say that this is not a green light. And I think the other really significant factor is this patchwork of statutes, rules, regulations that we have. So the federal government may be pulling back on regulation in certain areas, finance, the environment, AI. But you also have to recognize that some states perceive it as a void, and so they're stepping in. For example, New York and California on environment and AI. So you have this inconsistent patchwork of state and local laws and potential conflicts between federal, state law. And then, I think Travis alluded to this. If you're a multinational, you have to layer on top the foreign statutes. And then the other thing is, even if the U.S. does pull back on the federal level, you also have to consider your customers. So if your customers are subject to Scope 3 emissions reporting, they're going to still demand that you provide the information they need so they can report. Your investors are not monolithic. For example, if they're from Europe, they have a different outlook than many U.S. investors, and you also need to consider your own employees. But what can boards do? I think the first thing is to ensure you're receiving updates on the changing regulatory landscape. Management should be talking to you about the trends and how they can affect the business, and you shouldn't be hearing about these things after the fact. You should be hearing in advance, and so management can explain to you how they plan to comply, to the extent there's some clarity on the law, and how they intend to ensure compliance. You have to set the type and frequency of reporting, with management. And that's not always the easiest. That may be an iterative task as laws continue to change. And, if you think about areas that are changing so quickly, like regulation on AI, that can affect where and when a company, can use AI, sell an AI product. So this has to be taken into account in earlier stages. And then, in terms of where oversight of compliance is housed, it's often in the audit committee, I think sometimes almost by default. So of course, you have to question whether they have enough bandwidth. And some of these issues may be significant enough that they should be up at the full board level as the regulatory landscape challenges. And, I pulled what I thought was a somewhat interesting data point. We surveyed about 1,300 directors in January about adjustments to strategy, to reflect announced and anticipated policy changes from the new administration. So that's a pretty good sample size. Only 6% said they anticipated significant adjustments to strategy. About 40% said a moderate change. And over 40% cited no change, which I think is a really interesting number. And it may be a lot of those companies are just waiting to see what happens.
Thank you, Claudia. Vivek, you've been sitting there patiently, and particularly when Claudia talked about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the first thing I read was on the rhetoric side. I thought bribing was okay. I then read something a little more in depth, and I realized, no, it's still not okay. You still have to play by the rules. But that gets us to the question, Vivek. There's a ton of rhetoric going around, but rhetoric isn't policy. Rhetoric isn't certainty. How are you working with boards and coaching them about being in this for the long term? One of the questions that came through the Q&A chat was, is it just going to be like this for 4 years, and then 4 years we'll flip everything back? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. I think it will have something to do with who would be the next president, but that's like a lifetime from now. So what are boards doing today to drive businesses that need certainty, that need to make decisions that will hold up irrespective of who's sitting in the Oval Office? So share some thoughts about what's happening.
Yeah, no, sure thing, Dennis. And I think Claudia and Travis hit a little bit of this as they went through the regulatory environment and how that's changing. The crux, of course, is figuring out which to act on and which not to act. You act too soon and there's a problem, and you act too late and your competition has got you boxed up. And there are at least two areas that have been particularly interesting for me and boards that I've worked with. And they are in this energy emergency and Stargate space. And they're particularly interesting because they are going to affect nearly every aspect of every industry because of where they're strategically located. I like to think about it a bit, Dennis, as in if you went to the extremes, you had free energy and or you had infinite technology, you can pretty much do anything you want in terms of competitive advantage over the rest of the world. And you can produce more food, you can produce more products, you can produce metals, you can mine, you can convert one to the other, you can recycle. And so the effect that the environment will have on those, and not just the first order effects like Claudia described, but the second, third, fourth order effects are something that boards have to get their heads around, have to have their management teams really look ahead of. For instance, we have regulation around LNG. Is that real? Well, we do have advantaged gas. We have access in terms of locked up routes. We have customers. Will we go from 14 BCF to 45? Yeah, it's probably likely that will happen. Uh, what's the implication of that, not just for the 4 years, but longer term? Well, if I expect Stargate and data centers to push a lot of power demand, and I'm starting to feed that demand, and I'm having a lot more energy come into the mix, what happens to my supply chains? What happens to the welders, pipe fitters, boiler makers who are of short supply on the Gulf Coast? Do I need to act on that ahead of time? What are those scenarios? What exactly will the actions will happen? What portfolios do I need to get locked up? What sort of talent do I need to develop? These are things that I think boards have to worry about now, because irrespective of which direction it takes in the near term, these seem to be durable advantages. So you have to identify those durable advantages, scenario plan them out, and then have the no regret actions in place.